Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third in our webinar series on culture and engagement and presenting it into your organization. So I'm Valerie Schiemann, and I'm a principal here at Metrus Group. And in my past life, I was in a corporate role where I was in a position where I think many of you may be or may have been in the situation of trying to sell and position a project that I thought was of importance to senior leadership. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague Jerry Seibert, also a principal with Metrus Group, and he is the head of our assessment practice, and so has dealt over the years with many of the discussions about should we do it, could we do it, and what are the reasons. And I think he's got some great information to share with you. So we're privileged to have an hour with you this afternoon to share some of this information. I will tell you that certainly there will be the opportunity for questions, and you all have a bar on your screen where you can type in questions. If we don't have time to get to all of them, we will certainly get back to you either individually or collectively with a response. So please feel free to send us any questions or things that might come up during the talk. And also, so that you can hopefully be participative and not be too involved with note-taking, I want to let you know that we will make the majority of the slides. A few are proprietary to clients, but most of these slides will be available to you following the session. So with that, let's get started. A little bit about Metrus Group. Some of you, I think, have been on one of our sessions before, but for those who have not, Metrus Group is a company that has been in place for close to 30 years. We work in the area of data-based and information-based decisions and tools. So our focus is to be evidence-based and to use that to guide strategic business decisions. And certainly employee surveys in the people space is a key area where one can get that kind of information. We also have our institute, which is our research arm, and through that we do a lot of research, publications. A couple of our books are highlighted here on the screen. And if you will go to our website under the Metrus Institute, there are many papers that are available for download, and please help yourself to those. We would be delighted to share those with you. If you have any difficulty, contact Jerry or myself, and we'll be glad to assist. So the question we want to examine today is, as the title suggests, how do we sell this whole notion of culture and engagement to our senior leadership? It's so obvious to us that it should be easy. We should go in and say, you know, we need to address this, and they would immediately respond, yes, we should. It's the most critical area. Let's get at it. But I think probably there's no one on this call who has experienced that. I certainly have not, and I think I can speak for Jerry that he has not. And so the question is then, why isn't it easy if it's so obvious what the situation should be? And so what we might wonder is it the leadership? Do they really just not get it? Or might it be us? Might it be that we need to position our story a little bit differently? We need to speak to the leadership in the language that they will understand and respond to. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to introduce that by speaking to you a little bit about a recent book that we were privileged to participate in, The Rise of HR. And this was co-edited by our CEO, Bill Schiemann, in partnership with Dave Ulrich and Libby Sartain. And briefly, they asked a number of HR leaders around the globe what HR folks would need to know or do to be successful in the future environment. And in fact, they got responses from 73 people and put this into a book of essays. And this is available to you, just as a side note. It's available at no charge. It was underwritten by HRCI, and you can go to the HRCI website, Rise of HR, just Google it, and download it at no cost. So I encourage you to do that because it has a wealth of information. But what I want to talk to you today about is just very top line, what were the themes in that book? And what they determined was that all the essays that came back, despite their fear that maybe everybody would say the same thing, in fact it was a very broad range of responses, and the responses were categorized into 7 areas, which are listed here as the challenge areas. And interestingly, several of these really touch very closely on what we're going to talk about today. So the notion of setting context to strategy, the very first one, how do we connect with what we're doing in human resources, what we're doing with the people of the organization, to the overall business environment in which the company needs to operate. So it's not the people in a vacuum and taking care of them, it's what is their impact overall. And that's going to be one of the keys Jerry will talk about, is making that very broad connection. The next one, organization, is one that we at Metrus feel very close to, and it's been a core part of our work since day one, and that is the notion of diagnosis. Just as a physician will diagnose you before we hope he will diagnose you, or she will diagnose you before making a prescription or talking about surgery or what have you, so too we believe in the importance of diagnosis, of understanding what's going on, and then, only then, being able to make a statement about, here's what we believe the organization needs in order to be more successful in its business environment. And a lot of what we talk about today is that diagnosis. And then, of course, something that you're all very familiar with the importance of today, analytics and information. So how do we use that data? How do we collect it, design it, and use it so that we can make, and I'll say, effective decisions? There is so much data that we could collect it and make a lot of decisions, or derive a lot of conclusions. And the trick now, because there is so much data, is to be able to do that in a way that is effective and doesn't overwhelm us, so that we're getting at the things that are really of importance and focusing on the things that are most critical to our particular organizations. So I think all of these themes are going to have a lot of bearing on what Jerry is going to talk about with you today. And so I want to turn it over to him to explore these questions in a little more detail, and then also to give you a couple of great case examples at the end of organizations who have successfully done what we're going to be talking about today. So let me now introduce my colleague, Jerry Seibert, and he will take it from here.
Thanks, Valerie. I appreciate that, and welcome everyone. So the key question for today really is, how do you sell the importance of culture, employee engagement, whether we're talking development initiatives, surveys, what have you? How do you sell the importance of that to leadership? And I think one of the key things to remember is that it's really has to be put in the context of the leadership and of the business, and that it's not about HR and the things that HR wants to do. So these kinds of programs, when they're presented as, well, this is an HR initiative, are going to be much less compelling than if it's presented as, this is something the business needs to do because it has business impact. Now, of course, there's all kinds of objections that we might hear about, and this isn't a good time to do something like this, and that, sometimes that's true. It may be a bad time. There may be a lot of other things going on in the organization, but that should, of course, be only a temporary objection. Resources, cost, although it's interesting, no one ever suggests that we should maybe skip the annual report this year because it costs money to put that together and get it out, although taking a year off from, say, an annual employee survey is a fairly common suggestion. Reaching out to employees and asking what's on their mind, isn't that going to open us up to a whole bunch of demands or suggestions that we're just not able to comply with? Certainly people expect follow-through when you do something like that, but the employees are pretty realistic, and they know not every idea brought forth is going to get implemented. And you can see the rest of these. We find that employees are pretty open and pretty willing to give candid feedback as long as they can feel comfortable about the confidentiality of the process. But I think one of the key things is the last bullet there is leadership just not ready to receive that input or make use of it. And if that's the situation, that's a more fundamental concern, and you really need to understand why they might feel that way if you're going to have any impact on it. And this is something that we've certainly encountered, and sometimes this comes up because it's just not viewed as an urgent priority. Why would that be? Well, I would argue that this is a failure to gain buy-in by HR, by the group that is typically the one pushing for this. So you need to be able to put the idea in terms that are really in their language that they're going to resonate with. Sometimes people will challenge the cost. That really comes down to being able to explain clearly and with authority what the ROI on this sort of an investment could be. Again, whether it's an intervention, a survey, what have you. And sometimes there's a lack of interest because it's going to generate more work, and we're going to have to take decisive actions in response to this. And you know what? We've got plenty of other things on our plate, so why add one more thing? But the fact is, that's a lack of confidence in business impact. And if you can quantify business impact, then you're much more likely to be able to clear that as an objection or as a form of resistance. And sometimes that can be as simple as the context that we put things in, and understanding who it is you're talking to and the types of measures. And if you want to put in place a change in the type of people that you're bringing in to better fit with your culture, and people who will do a better job, say, of supporting your customer focus in your organization. There's different ways you can measure that kind of a change in talent acquisition. And efficiency measures like average time to fill is not it, right? That, of course, is always something important to HR, but it's not going to make the kind of case you want. A little bit better would be, an effectiveness measure, right? If we can not just measure how quick we're filling, but how long people are staying, because that has impact on their skills development, and that ultimately affects the customers. That's better, but really the best part or the best approach would be measures of actual impact. So if we can make the case that this change is going to help us bring in talent that will do a better job of meeting customer needs, that's going to affect customer satisfaction. Well, now you're talking in a language that the C-suite already understands directly impacts the bottom line and the success of the organization. So just thinking through the types of the way that you're presenting information, the type of data that you use to back up your arguments is really important. To sell culture and engagement initiatives, there's really three things you've got to do. You've got to be on point, connect to business decisions, and be able to model the ROI. And I'm going to talk a bit about each of those. When it comes to being on point, say for example you're interested in doing a survey or a cultural assessment, understanding where your organization is and what it's prepared to do is an important part of judging what kind of program to recommend. Some organizations, are really only interested in becoming aware of issues that might be out there, sort of a temperature-taking approach, on the assumption that, well, it's better to know what people are thinking than not know. And that's a very basic approach. It's not going to really help you link to business outcomes. You're not going to get a lot of commitment to use the results one way or the other. An entitlement-focused survey, something that's really all about job satisfaction or satisfaction with pay and benefits, those sorts of things, is a little better because you can link that to some measures of employee relations. But the commitment by management here is really just to address maybe some burning issues that might be out there. Engagement surveys are a bit better because now you're looking at things like employee commitment, willingness to put in discretionary effort, be advocates for the company and stay with the company. And now you can actually connect the results. You can argue that this is a way for us to understand how to impact things like turnover and productivity. So now we're getting closer to the language that's really compelling for senior leaders. But really, the next level up, a strategic approach, has, I think, the most ability to compel attention from senior leadership, where you go beyond engagement and look at other factors that link strongly to business outcomes and actually design a program around the strategic goals and the business goals of the company, because now your initiative becomes something that helps to manage the business, not something that helps just to manage people. Also, you have to be aligned with that strategy to be on point. So you need to have a crystal clear understanding of those top goals for your organization. What is the strategy and how are we going to achieve that in the broadest sense? And of course, within that, your workforce strategy should be based on those goals. What are the critical things we need from our people if we're going to achieve the strategic goals? And then for HR specifically, being clear on how the particular initiatives, the investments you're making, how do those impact the performance on those specific people results that we know are necessary for the organization to reach specific strategic goals. That line of sight from your HR strategy to the broader workforce strategy to the organization strategy is essential if you're going to be able to make compelling arguments. And just as an example, I mean, think about 3 different retail organizations. They all run a chain of stores, but they have very different strategies. And those strategies require different kinds of talent in the organizations. So depending on whether you're focused on cost or innovation or customer intimacy, you're going to need different skills from your people, and there are different ways of engaging those different workforces. The values for the organization can be built into performance management. They can be built in as questions in employee surveys to see if people think you're really living those surveys. You would have different competency models that emphasize different skills depending on the company strategy. Job design would certainly vary because the engagement drivers are going to be different. I experienced this a few years ago. I was actually down in Australia giving a series of talks, and as I arrived in Brisbane, I arrived without my luggage on a Sunday afternoon, and the local I was traveling with said, "Oh, no worries. We are so casual here in Australia that you can actually rent a business suit for your meeting," which was a great idea, except it was a Sunday evening and all those places were in fact closed. And so we ended up at a department store, a chain called Myers, at about 15 minutes before closing, and went into the men's department, explained the problem, and it was like an all hands on deck call. I had someone mix and matching parts of suits off the rack while somebody else was picking out shirts and ties that went with that. One of the staff actually offered to hem the pants for me, and about 15 minutes after clothing, I walked out of there with everything from shoes to jacket that I needed for the next day. And I was talking to the salesperson. I said, you can tell from my accent that I'm not from around here. I'm not, I'm not going to be coming back to make repeat purchases. So why, were you willing to do all this? And he said, well, it's what we like to do. The people here enjoy helping. And it was a great case example of an organization with a customer intimate focus and the kind of talent that they brought in to support that sort of a strategy. But there's other implications for strategy around what you choose to measure and the types of things that will that the measurement of will support the strategy. Efficiency and speed for cost leaders, are the important values versus autonomy and creativity or empowerment for the other strategies, those competencies that I mentioned that can be so different by strategy, and thinking about engaging the workforce. What are the types of things that will engage the people that you want to have, or rather, you want to have people who are engaged by specific things, and that can guide selection programs, survey programs, and other types of interventions. You also want to be able to connect very clearly to business decisions, and really a strategic approach like we've been talking about can allow you to make all sorts of connections. I was talking a bit about how it can connect and support strategy execution, but well-designed programs around culture and engagement can also give you key insights into leader development. So understanding how well particular teams are being engaged or not by their leaders can give you some real insights into where some specific development opportunities might be. How clearly are they conveying the strategy and direction of the business? So understanding the degree of alignment within a team can also give you some important information about leader development opportunities. Certainly it connects to the talent life cycle and understanding, at what point you might be at risk of losing people in their talent life cycle. Even risk management can connect to this sort of thing. If, for example, people feel that bringing forth new ideas is not well supported by the company, that puts the company at risk of losing ground in the innovation race. Or if people are simply afraid to speak up if they have a concern, that's a risk issue for the company, and being aware of that is extremely important. When it comes to something like an employee survey, you can design this sort of thing in by thinking about the survey content. You're not necessarily going to get that from some off-the-shelf set of questions, but if you take the time to try and match what you're measuring to your strategy, the culture, the goals, and plan your survey with certain specific decisions in mind, you can have a real impact on the business. How do you do that? Well, I think the most effective way would be for you to have one-on-one conversations with senior leaders, to talk to them about their specific business goals for their business unit, what they need from their people to accomplish that, and what they feel they really need to know about their teams. And you design content around that. You ask them, well, if we knew X, what decision would you be able to make from that? Those conversations can give you deep insights into what we should really focus on in an assessment, a cultural assessment, an engagement survey, what have you, for our organization. And with a content designed that way, the link to specific business outcomes is really designed right in to the process. You're really selling a few basic propositions here. That employee engagement or the culture that the employee engagement is a key driver of company success. That one of the key sources of employee engagement is the culture itself, which of course is not an abstract concept. It's really something that's expressed and manifested in the policies and the practices and the interactions. I mean, culture is something that is lived and not just this idea that is out there. And really, senior leadership is a major driver of that culture. Their behaviors, their actions, their attitudes, for example, have a huge impact. Whether or not the company values are just a plaque on the wall or something that is really used in making decisions in the organization is very much a top-down driven factor. Now, we understand engagement via an assessment, surveys, focus groups. So asking the people who know the culture best, is a powerful way to understand that culture and how well positioned we are with our culture to achieve our business goals. Now, of course, there's an empirical case to be made as well, right? There's a lot of research out there that's looked at differences between companies with different types of culture, different levels of employee engagement. You know, one study that was published in The Enthusiastic Employee showed that the top quartile on overall satisfaction for employee engagement, those companies tended to have much better stock market performance compared to their industry. The middle quartiles not so much, and the bottom quartile actually underperformed. Best companies to work for data shows much better returns for the top 100 companies in that database compared to the S&P 500, whether we're looking at annualized returns or cumulative returns. You know, so there are things like stock market performance, but employee engagement, employee morale has been shown to be connected to a lot of other factors as well, very closely connected to withdrawal behavior, things like turnover and absenteeism, you know, whether or not people actually are doing the work they need to or are just retired on the job, efficiency, customer satisfaction, productivity and performance measures. The advisory board reported that engaged employees were 1.5 times more likely than even content employees who were just sort of the next level down on the engagement scale to receive the top performance review score in their organization. So there's a lot of empirical data out there to support the value. But sometimes you may hear that, well, you know, our great places or best places data show, you know, we're reasonably engaged here. So, you know, why go to all this effort just to sort of redocument that again? Sometimes engagement is not enough. One of the things we have found in our research, and we have a lot of papers and books for that matter published on this, is that beyond engagement, there are other factors that can very strongly link to business outcomes. Alignment and capabilities tend to do the best job of complementing engagement in that process. Valerie, could you stop? When I talk about alignment, I'm talking about alignment from my goals as an individual employee to department goals to organizational goals, those strategic goals. Are we aligned on our brand promise to the organization or to our customers? And do I see alignment across managers? Do we all seem to be on the same page with shared objectives? And capabilities really means, do we have the right people with the right skills, the information we need when we need it, and the resources we need to deliver for our customers? And engagement, I'm sure you're very familiar with, it's not just how satisfied I am with my job and the organization, but it's commitment. It's intention to stay with the organization and willingness to put in discretionary effort and even be an advocate on behalf of the organization. And really, you know, we're talking about touching not just the heart of employees or measuring what's in their hearts, but competencies and you know, what's in their minds as well. So it's sort of a head, hands, and heart approach. And sometimes people might say, well, you know, if you're high on engagement, aren't the others going to be relatively high as well? But the fact is, what we have seen is that these are really pretty independent measures from each other, and that there are a lot of different profiles that can be achieved when you're looking at alignment, capabilities, and engagement, which we often call ACE for short, ACE. Ideally, you'd want to have an optimized talent profile, high scores across the board, but if you look at all these various profiles that are possible, only the first 4 have high engagement. You can have a misguided enthusiasm profile where people are engaged despite not being sure about the direction the company's going, or even not feeling they have the necessary resources to execute. strategic disconnect. You know, they've got the resources, they're engaged as a group, but they may be very happily working on the wrong priorities as a group. These are all very common profiles that we see across organizations, and what you really want to avoid is the one on the bottom, the high risk profile, because that is the profile of groups that are guaranteed to be underperforming on other important business metrics. We see it in many, many organizations. And you can take these profiles. One of the things we like to do, especially for senior leaders, is just lay them out on top of the organizational chart, because it's a great way to see across the organization very quickly where there are key opportunities, what kind of issues might be consistent across the business, and where there may be unique patterns of results. This was data, I changed all the names on it, but it was real data from a client. And one of the things I'll point out is right in the middle here, you'll see this supply chain group with very low scores on alignment and capability, but a very high score on engagement. And I remember when I shared these results, a couple of members of the executive team sort of chuckled ruefully and said, well, in hindsight, they weren't at all surprised to see that. It was a group that had been together a long time, same manager, same employees, and really what they had was a group that was highly engaged with their manager and less so with the company. And in fact, that manager tended to want to, quote, protect the group from changes coming down from corporate. And the employees saw that, and so they knew some of the things they were doing were not aligned with the direction of the business, and they weren't making use of all the tools that were available to them. So they were low, and they were very candid. It's like, you know, no, we don't really see the connection between what we're doing and company goals. And they were right, because they weren't that well connected. But they did like working together. They knew each other. They were friends. They liked their manager. But it's not a sustainable profile. And in fact, the repercussions it was having with other groups who depended on them were becoming more and more clear over time. And it just underscored in a way that hadn't been obvious before that this was a leader and a team that needed some team development and not necessarily a change in the leader, but some development there as well to help them get the bigger picture and understand how they can do better for the organization. But they could also see it, you know, at first what looked like terrible results for the sales division was really being driven just by one region, and how alignment was an issue that was very consistent for sales, but less so for other parts of the organization. So at a glance, a lot of powerful information can be made available if you are gathering the right data for your organization through your assessment process. And just a little background, we've published a lot of research on ACE, and even more so than has been seen with engagement, we've seen very strong connections across many companies to low turnover, financial and quality metrics, even much higher scores on things like internal customer service, so the service that departments like HR, finance, IT provide to other groups, much higher with companies that are high on alignment, capabilities, engagement than on engagement alone. But there's other kinds of learnings that you can find and cases that you can make for senior leaders, or things that you can investigate. A lot of companies are, you know, very focused on their high potential employees. But what if you were starting to lose some high potentials? You know, if turnover was up among that group, that would be very disconcerting, because you think about everything that you're putting into those people. Well, that was happening with one organization I worked with, and so the first thing we did was say, well, how much are these people putting in to the company? And we looked at the distribution of the typical hours of employees other than the high potentials, and we looked at it across high potentials, and weren't surprised to see a lot more effort being put in by the hypos. That was sort of expected. But actually, the skewness of that distribution was a little more than, actually it was a fair bit more than the organization was expecting. And so, when we talked about the increase in turnover there, and looked at some reports of feelings of burnout and lack of work-life balance, there was a very candid discussion among the leadership team. And it didn't take long for them to have a real mea culpa and agree that, on the whole, they had come to rely on those designated high potentials and not simply assign them extra projects for the purposes of development, but really as the group who were the go-to group. If you needed something done quickly, if you wanted to be sure it was done right the first time, that's who you assign it to. And that's not really what a high potential program is all about. So their action plan was to change that behavior, because frankly it really came from that group making those decisions. And a year later, while the distribution of work hours for other employees hadn't really changed, there was a significant shift in the distribution, and many fewer employees. The turnover issue had gone away, and people were feeling much better about their work-life balance, which is not to say that they were putting in the same hours as regular employees. And part of the reason you probably get a hypo designation is you're a very motivated person willing to work a little harder than the average employee. But it was a big shift for just a one-year period.
So Jerry, if I could jump in here for a minute, I think the examples that you're showing are great pictures of what people have been able to discover through the survey. And relating back to some of the things we talked about earlier, I think you could envision how much more powerful it would be for the people who launch these programs to be talking about what they intended to do in terms of, we have a significant risk in losing our high potentials, and look at what we've invested in those people. Look at the difference that they make to the company, and perhaps 2 or 3 other items that you were wanting to investigate. And a process for getting at that is our survey process, as opposed to just coming in with the survey process. This is something we really should do, the things we could learn. It's a very tangible way to connect with senior leaders who, I think Jerry is right, we see a lot of people are concerned about growing and retaining and keeping high potential people. They are the leaders of the future, big investment. And so by positioning this as addressing the business issue first, I think it can be very powerful. And there are many examples, and Jerry, I know, has a couple more, but there are many examples of how people have done that.
Yeah, so just a couple of other quick examples then. One of the things that you can look at to understand alignment within the organization is, asking people in an employee survey, oh, do you understand our strategy? Do you understand our goals? And see if people agree or disagree with that sort of a question. And I've certainly done that many times in the past, but it doesn't actually answer the question, do people really know? Do people really understand? So instead, why not ask them, what are the top priorities? We did that with one organization. They had 3 that they had been communicating and cascading through the organization. So we asked people what were those, but we gave them a longer list to choose from just to see how many got it right. And yeah, at the C-suite and the senior VP level, pretty much all of them did. But below that, not so much. Even at the VP level, only around 60% were selecting the right 3 priorities. And when you got down to district managers and managers, it was even more of a mixed response. And the choices, the alternate choices we provided were meaningful things for this company. So what did this tell them? Well, You could argue it told them that their cascading communication effort failed, that it broke down below the SVP level, and there's certainly some truth to that. But what was really going on were a lot of mixed messages to various management levels. So the top priorities might have been communicated pretty clearly to them, but when it comes time to actual making decisions at the manager and district manager level, the way those decisions were going were basically sending a message to those folks that, yeah, no, what's really important is something else despite the stated goals. And that can create a lot of inefficiencies within an organization. Not having that clarity and that consistency of messaging. You can also learn things by, for example, looking at your data by performance level. So comparing high performers to low performers. And in this case, the organization wasn't surprised to find that their top performers were much more likely to agree that pay was linked to performance than low performers, because no one likes to think of themselves as being a low performer. They were concerned, though, about the second question that we see here, where the low performers were much less likely to agree that they were being treated with respect and dignity by management. And that was troubling because the performance management system was meant to be something constructive to help people improve performance. And this red flag led the organization to find that there were a number of managers who were really using it in a very non-constructive way with their employees. But the question that caused the biggest raise in eyebrows was, we have enough people in my department to do quality work, where basically the same level of agreement, 50% among high performers and low performers, but the high performers were much more likely to disagree, to give unfavorable responses to the statement. And that told the leadership that, well, everybody has some concerns here, but the high performers are particularly concerned, and maybe feeling that others weren't carrying their weight, or that they were the ones who got stuck picking up the extra work in the situation where maybe there weren't enough resources within the group. So there are a lot of strategic insights that you can gain with the proper approach to gathering data and to analyzing it. And in some, you need to, for your organization, be able to clearly articulate that business case and to convincingly explain how employee attitudes or how organizational culture can drive business results. And that stronger culture, whether you're looking across companies or within your own, that those stronger cultures outperform companies or units with weaker cultures. You need to be able to show how what you're wanting to do, if it's data gathering, is going to be actionable, not just interesting or nice to know. So hypothesize about the specific decisions that you would make if results came out a certain way. So if you say, well, we want to learn about topic X, hypothesize, okay, if we learn this, what can we actually do about it? Would we do anything about it? I often tell clients, who want to ask a lot of questions about pay and benefits in an employee survey, okay, are you actually going to change the compensation program based on the survey results? And they say, well, no, that's based on market data and comp studies that we do. So, okay, then why take up valuable real estate in your survey with those kinds of questions if you're not really going to be able to take action on them? You need to be able to demonstrate, and you might be doing some modeling here or some hypothesizing here as well, but how this expense is very likely to be greatly outweighed by the return. So if you can calculate the cost of turnover, and even if you're using research data or market data on the impact of engagement or other factors on turnover or productivity, you can make a case for a return that I can almost guarantee you is going to be significantly more than the investment required. But you do need to be rigorous. You may have to do a little research on your own, pull some data out of the literature, but then when it comes time to making your case, remember, simpler is always better. You want to be able to make your argument quickly. You may want to have a lot of detailed information in your back pocket if you get challenged or if questions are raised, but you want to use a very simple sort of declarative approach that this is what we're going to learn, and this is how we're going to be able to impact absenteeism, or this is how we're going to be able to impact certain financial results. And this really can be done. I want to share a couple of case studies with you in the time we have remaining. And one is from the Jack in the Box. It's a quick service restaurant chain. It includes both the Jack in the Box restaurants and the Qdoba Mexican Eats restaurants. Over 2,200 in the Jack group and almost 700 in the Qdoba group, second only to Chipotle. Now, one of the things they did is looked at a lot of data that was available in the company first. So what were the real differences between their best performing units and their lowest performing units? And one thing they found was that the best performing units were showing year-over-year sales growth, while the worst performing were showing almost equivalent year-over-year sales declines. They looked at whether or not those better performing versus other units were competing effectively. And what this chart is showing is same-store sales over time. So either growth or decline in same-store sales, with the blue line representing the Jack in the Box locations and the red line representing the rest of the market. And what they found, for example, here, their best performing units were doing about the same as the competition in 2014, until they introduced a new product, which they called internally Buttery Jack, and then they started seeing much better gains than the competition. And even as the competition launched major new initiatives, they pretty much held on to those gains for the next couple of years. On the other hand, the lower performing units had been underperforming the competition. So you can see here the blue line is below the red line in 2014. With that new product introduction, they actually caught up to and surpassed the competition, but they could not hold on to those gains. They very quickly, were doing about the same, and then started to lose what they had gained. And then as new products were launched by the competition, all-day breakfast and value lunch menus, they really lost ground and were performing worse than they had been before. So the question came up, well, what is the difference between these locations? Because their processes, their systems, their talent selection, all those sorts of things were pretty much the same. And if you controlled for them and you controlled for the market and so forth, what else could we really learn that would help us understand and turn around those underperforming units? And one of the things we looked at with them was their ACE scorecards. For every restaurant and every area and every region, what kind of profiles were we finding in those restaurants? And could we identify the ones who were at high risk? And in fact, we could, and those were very much the same restaurants that were underperforming on all of the business metrics. In fact, we were able to do some predictive modeling that showed that we could predict turnover at the restaurant level and explain as much as half of the difference in turnover rates between restaurants just using alignment capabilities and engagement. And what does that mean in practical terms? It meant a reduction in turnover of 21 percentage points and an increase in productivity of 2.3 percentage points. And in this business, any kind of gain like that is very important. And just imagine a restaurant manager and how much less time they have to spend reviewing applications and training new staff if you can cut turnover by 21%. We looked at the same thing for customer satisfaction and could explain about a third of the difference in customer satisfaction across restaurants. Again, in practical terms, what did that mean? And what kind of ROI were they able to see? Guest problems down by 14%, satisfaction up by 5 points, and problem resolution improved by 56% with the high ACE restaurants. Even profitability, about 40% in the difference in profitability across restaurants was explainable through alignment capabilities and engagement. Sales 10% higher and profitability 30% higher. In the baseline assessment we did, there was over $5 million, $25 million in savings identified simply by moving those high-risk units out of that profile. They didn't even have to be moved all the way up to the triple green optimized profile. There was that much room for improvement. Now, a retail environment is great because it's very easy to connect results to outcomes like that. But other businesses can do that as well. And the other case study that I wanted to share was really from a healthcare organization. So RWJBarnabas Health, we've worked with the RWJ portion of that organization, but as a total organization, they're a huge healthcare provider here on the East Coast. We looked, for example, at absenteeism in several of the hospitals, and found that across units, across departments, we could explain more than a quarter of the variance in absenteeism through alignment capabilities and engagement combined. And in fact, you were able to also identify some of the top drivers around that. So in groups, for example, that felt there was within their team a strong commitment to improvement and discretionary effort, they were much less likely to see absenteeism, high absenteeism, than other units. And these were areas that they targeted and were able to show some real improvements between an initial baseline measurement and a subsequent assessment. Patient satisfaction was even stronger in its connection. Almost 70% of the variance in patient satisfaction across nursing units explained by ACE. High-risk units significantly lower in patient satisfaction than those with an optimized talent profile, that triple green on ACE. And one item stood out well above the others as a driver there, whether or not staff reported that their department had the needed resources and tools to meet patient and colleague expectations. And focusing on that led to some substantial improvements in overall patient satisfaction. In fact, the shift in the distribution, how many of these different profiles they saw across the organization was really dramatic. In the first year, 43% of the departments were in what we call the tipping point profile, which is to say they didn't have any scores in the green. Everything was in the yellow or red. After 1 year of focused effort, that was almost reversed, with 44% in that optimized talent or triple green profile. So really dramatic change, which then directly connected not just to absenteeism and patient satisfaction, but we looked at productivity and other factors as well throughout the organization. So again, just to wrap up and allow some time for questions, when you are proposing a culture or engagement related program and management seems to be resistant, a little self-reflection is a good way to start. You know, is this really them? Is this the approach? Am I not using the right kinds of data, the things, am I not speaking their language? How can I connect this to the business strategy and the business environment if I'm going to sell this type of program or convince them of its value? When you think about the outcomes and you want to talk about impact, talk about the same ones that are driving their decision just like the rest of the business. And don't assume that metrics that you're used to using within HR are really going to be compelling in the same way. Some of them aren't even really outcome measures. They're operational measures for the department. Because remember, your goal ultimately with the initiatives, with the programs that you want to put in place are to help guide their decision making around people and the types of investments they want to make to enable the people who make up the organization to execute that strategy to deliver for your customers, for your clients. And so being able to present them information in a context and in a format that they're used to, tying it to business outcomes, linking it, showing how it connects to the business strategy is really going to be the most compelling way to bring them around to you. And finally, you know, just some things that you can think about doing today, right away, to help you in this process. Think about your strategic relationships with business leaders, right? What kinds of connections can you form, not just with the leaders you typically work with, but with line leaders throughout the organization. If your business acumen is not up to snuff, then that is certainly something you can work on. If you don't understand the balance sheet and P&L statements and all of that, well, you ought to be able to, and you ought to be able to talk the lingo. As a department, rotating roles within HR and with line relationships can be a very powerful way. Bringing people from outside HR into the group and having people within HR take time and roles outside of HR is a great way to build some of that company-specific business acumen. Looking for mentors, people who will be willing to coach you in these sorts of things, and just staying up to date. You know, Schiemann puts out tons and tons of reading material, and it's good to stay on top of that stuff, but you should put in just as much effort staying on top of what's available in the Wall Street Journal and the financial press and so forth. So with that, I'm going to pause here, and Valerie, are there any questions that we need to address?
We do have one quick one, and you touched on it at the beginning, but before I segue to that, I want to just make a brief mention that the first case that Jerry spoke about, the Jack in the Box case, is actually a very good example for all of us to use, and I want to compliment them for winning in 2017, being recognized for their work by receiving the HRM Impact Award, which is given by jointly Schiemann and SIOP and their respective foundations. And the recognition is for work that is done using evidence-based tools and techniques to drive business results. So they were shown or selected as a landmark example of exactly what we're talking about. And if you need more information on that, it certainly is available, and we'll include some when we send the slides. So, Jerry, the question, and you touched on it when you talked about Jack in the Box, is the importance of connecting the employee data to other external data, the kind of data that we pay often a lot more attention to, which is the customer. And certainly the Jack in the Box example showed some of that. Do you have any other thoughts on that, or other cases where you have done work containing the employee and the customer work and how they connect?
Yes, and there's multiple kinds of customer data. So the Jack in the Box case study used that, and of course the Robert Wood Johnson one with the patient satisfaction metrics as well. And in any customer-facing organization, that's one of the best metrics to use. So it's pretty common. But there's also internal customer data. And that's actually easy to collect at the same time as an employee survey, and that's a way to find out how well departments are meeting the needs of the groups, the internal groups who depend on them. And so if you don't have a good source of external customer data, you can use internal customer data and look at the relationships between internal service providers, and almost every department has other groups that depend on them, and use that as sort of a substitute for external customer data. And I think with that we have come to the end of our scheduled time. I see there might be a couple of other questions that we didn't get to, so we'll have to respond to those in some follow-up communications. But we do appreciate everybody's time this afternoon, and as Valerie said, we will send out copies of the slides to everyone. And once again, thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar.